Good morning. I'm Peter Park, and I'm from Denver. And I talk about how better codes and regulations actually help enhance readiness for TOD, and to what degree, to some degree, how context-informed based approaches could help. I was the planning director in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Denver, Colorado. And oversaw the rewrite of the zoning code and the remapping of the zoning in those two cities, updating their 50-year-old codes. I'm working on the same kind of project in the small city of Los Angeles, updating its zoning code, which is crazy, but also in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas might be even crazier than LA when it comes to zoning. But in all these cases, it's really about how do we get to be more proactive about development, and how do codes actually help us position ourselves to be more proactive rather than reactive and negotiated and very transactional. And bottom line, it's a question of how do we get the development that we want faster in more predictable ways for communities and for developers. It's not an either-or proposition, and better codes can help us get there. So let me give you some background of the Denver experience first, and just a brief background on TOD in Denver. We have this major expansion of our public transit system going on in the region, and it creates significant new opportunities for changing how we grow in this region and in this city. In Denver, we have a growth strategy, and hopefully you all do too, right? And it's important to have a growth strategy for so many different reasons, but in Denver, for the city, it's a very simple notion of identifying areas of change and areas of stability. The darker colors here are areas of change, meaning that's where we'd rather have to prioritize new development, especially transit-oriented development. And in Blueprint Denver, we talk about density as being desirable, right? I remember, right, having been a former planning director, you go to a public meeting and, good evening, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help, and we're going to talk about adding density in your neighborhood tonight. Doesn't always go so well. And it's ridiculous to think about it that way. But on the other hand, the reality is the boundaries are fixed. We are going to grow. So it's a question of how do we grow? Where do we grow? And when? And so much of this work in Denver was about identifying implementation, not about just high-level planning, right? But how's this really going to happen? In 2006, we prepared a strategic TOD plan. There have been 21 station area plans completed since 2006. A major part of this actually is updating the entire zoning code for the city of Denver, and that may not make such a clear linkage to TOD, but I hope I'll be able to explain that. And there's been a recent update of the TOD strategic plan in 2014. But here's the challenge. When you look at this map and you see the circles, sort of the half-mile circles around the station areas in Denver, you see the lowest density of residential and the lowest density of employment, right? So in some ways you'd say, well, that's an opportunity. But the reality is these are the hardest places to do development, and they're constrained by barriers of highways or rivers or railroads. Is that familiar to you? Yeah. So it's an odd thing that we say, yeah, we're going to grow, we're going to accept the growth, and here's where we want to grow. And to the development investment market, you say, yeah, but those are the hardest places to go. And the entitlement isn't there, and some environmental conditions may persist. Yeah, but that's where we want you to go. We want you to stay out of the neighborhoods. Okay, well then we need to figure out how do we set up a system proactively, especially in the regulatory realm, to deal with the potential and that opportunity and capitalize on those opportunities. So in Denver, here's what the opportunities are. By 2016, 81 miles of the 122 miles of the expansion of the light rail will happen. The city's growing, the region's growing, the population is also aging. And the state of Colorado overall is densifying. Right now, 70% of the households really comprise a strong market for TOD. These are single households, these are married with no children, and these are single 65 and older. That's 70% of the population. And on the millennial end of what Dina was talking about, Denver was, of the top 7 gainers of population of millennials, Denver was #1. So we do think that there's a number of major important trends to capitalize on TOD. People in Denver are driving less. It's still very auto-oriented, but people are driving less. The city's making significant bike infrastructure investments, and people are walking and biking more. So in 2006, we set out to define an overall strategy, identifying a system of station area typologies from downtown to major urban centers to main streets, a whole range, and described a scale. You can see proposed scale, 5 stories and above, 5 stories above, 2 to 7 stories. So early on in this whole discussion of the station areas, and Gil was mentioning this, is identifying that it's not all the same thing. TOD is not one thing. And recognizing then implicit in that the importance of context and where is it? Because we have a number of stations that are in existing neighborhoods, a number of stations in greenfield sites and brownfield sites, a whole range. And these typologies were mapped and they became the starting point, not the final end all, but the starting point for how we set out to do and prioritize the preparation of station area plans. So the starting point for the station area plan, the early assignment of particular type, and then that was basically verified and continues to be verified in the station area planning that goes on. The overall update of the zoning code also was a significant part of the TOD effort in Denver. And oftentimes, well, zoning. There's a lot of confusion about zoning, right? A lot of places I go to, people think, well, isn't planning zoning? Or, no, I know the difference between planning and zoning. We do zoning instead of planning, right? Or, zoning is the way that we get the things that we don't want to pay for, isn't it? Right? That's what we do. That's what zoning's supposed to be about. Well, in the reorganization or the update of codes, there's significant opportunity to think about the substantive aspects of the code, you know, the uses, the various calibrations, but also the format and the structure. How's the code organized? How do you navigate code? Right? It ought not be a secret code. I don't think that's the intention, but it seems that way a lot of times, right? Works well for some people. I mean, there's a whole army of attorneys and lobbyists that thrive on the dysfunction of these laws. But if you think about it, they're the laws. They should be simple and understandable. And then there's also the procedural piece. Again, how do we apply these laws? They're either there up front, or we make them up and negotiate them project by project by project. And the challenge of doing the latter is that when you're negotiating each project and very creative zoning occurs, it's hard to enforce it long term, right? It adds more time, it adds more cost. And if you care about the quality of design in your community, if you care about affordability, why would you have a regulatory system that makes it more expensive, right? So this was the case in Denver, this was the case in Milwaukee, this is the case in many cities. So the overall update of the code really has been about how do we get into a more proactive position. Now, significant starting point for this, and we're taking this approach in LA and in Austin, is thinking about context, right? That in Denver and in other cities, we have a whole range of eras that the city evolved, from the most walkable transit-based, let's say, to the most automobile-based. And most zoning codes in many cities treat residential neighborhoods, for example, as one size fits all, right? And it just creates more confusion and more problems for codes and for achieving the vision in plans. In Denver, in other cities, new codes, context-based codes, identify the different contexts from suburban to downtown. Right? In Denver, we have suburban, urban edge, and urban. These are primarily single-family residential neighborhoods of different densities and intensities, but the zoning districts within each of these contexts varies. The single-family zone districts in suburban are very different than the single-family zone districts in urban, right? And it's by that kind of distinction that you can make a much more successful code and politically viable and supportable system as well. In terms of form-based regulations, I advocate for them because they support physical planning. And talking about form and place and character of place and imaging those places in conversations with the general public, people understand that. And it gives you a chance to really focus on what people care about and can talk about. And so it's really about how do we balance form and use. Form-based codes are not, it's not like they don't control use, they do. I mean, that's crazy to think that you cannot control use. They do. It's just that there's a better balance between the form controls and the use. And I advocate for moving more to clear form controls versus a lot of formulas. And I'll describe what I mean by that. But it's about defining a range, having flexibility within a very clearly defined range, because again, good zoning practice is about creating predictability. Form-based codes are very supportive, and because they depend on graphics rather than thousands of words to explain what your intent is. And in this way, I think they become very useful to communicate plans, right? We do the plans, and then we do the zoning. And hopefully there's a relationship between the two. But to the extent that you can use technique that actually has the codes explaining the intent of the plan, you can convey that to both the community as well as developers much faster. So it's about clarity. You know, so instead of focusing on words and a lot of legalese to explain it, don't do that. Rely on simple diagrams. Do you know what Legos are? These little toys? Okay? There are no words describing how to make the Millennium Falcon, you know, the 12,000, you know, Luke Skywalker's Millennium Falcon, right? Little super simple, clear diagrams can get you there, right? And by the way, you know, architects don't actually want to read a lot of words. They like to look at pictures, right? So those are the people that really need to understand what's going on. In Denver, the code is basically laid out in 2 pages with graphics on one side and symbol tables on the other side. 90% of the information that you need to know on a zone district, you find on these 2 pages. The code is really big, right? Because it's a complicated city. There are a lot of contexts, there are a lot of zone districts. But when it comes to your site, it's a very simple system of information to know. We did away with floor area ratio as a measure, as a quantification measure. I describe it as a formless formula because, you know, an FAR of 4, for example, could be configured in 4 stories, 8 stories, 16 stories, 32 stories. Okay? I've been in enough neighborhood meetings that people can tell the difference between 4 stories and 32 stories. Just, you want me to run through it again? Right? You get it, right? So, but the FAR does not do that. FAR, in fact, suggests the further a building is away from other buildings, the better, which is the most anti-urban composition that I can imagine, right? So, rather than these quantifiable measures, we moved more to qualitative. And it gave us a chance to prioritize our planning, especially along, for example, commercial corridors like Colfax Avenue. We did a plan with a focus on strengthening investment on that corridor, a bus corridor that is now becoming a BRT corridor, and enhancing the neighborhoods adjacent to it, right? It's a former streetcar line, very urban neighborhoods, single-family neighborhoods right adjacent to it. But the parking requirements, the FAR standards, were completely out of whack in achieving the vision of having walkable urban conditions. Under the previous zoning, the B4, it's not text shorthand, it's actually the B4 zoning, business 4. This is basically what you get under the old B4, right? Not what people had envisioned a main street, a vibrant main street would look like. You couldn't build these buildings, and all the older buildings you see in the image were non-conforming, okay? So it's a little funny. You've got a zoning law that makes the things that you want illegal and the things you don't want the easiest thing to build. That's awesome, right? So we went through the planning process to explain that here's the problem. The code is actually making it difficult to get what we want. To get the development that we want, we need to negotiate for 2 years. What? That doesn't make any sense. So the old zoning, the FAR of 1, coupled with high parking requirements, made the building on top non-conforming, and the building on the bottom, you see the building on the bottom behind that parking lot? Yeah. So we weren't able to achieve the vision. It was a car-based system, but it was really a threat to the neighborhood. The interesting thing about this with the Main Street zoning, we actually increased the density to create development that fit better with the neighborhood. What? Yeah, it's possible to do. right? So what we ended up doing is saying, what's important is where you put the building. Define building street corners and edges, have ground story activation requirements, right? It doesn't require retail. If you're residential, these are the ground story activation requirements. If it's residential, you know, so, and have proper height transitions to the adjacent context, because it is a context-based system. But in this way, we actually helped return back to Main Street. Even, you know, typical chain retailers can figure it out, you know. They can put a front door on the street. They can have windows on the street. And they realize that it actually works. They don't like to do it because they have suburban prototypes that they want to plunk down everywhere. But it's not like they can't do it. If the law says they have to do it, then everybody has to do it, then they will. But if you negotiate it on site by site, they're first going to try not to. And if they get away with it, they will. So even the playing field, be clear, and it's much better. In this case, we got rid of FAR 1, right? We actually defined the density more in terms of building heights. Because in conversations with neighborhood, we could say a 3-story Main Street, a 5-story Main Street, an 8-story Main Street. And people get it. And they forget about FAR. For the property owners, we essentially increased the effective density in ways that the neighborhood liked the fact that they're limited to 3 stories. Okay, so the conversation was about form, not about these quantities. I'm amazed how many rezoning negotiations in Denver are like FAR of 2.79. 2.79. How did we get to 2.79? Well, 3 was too much, you know, and we weren't going to go with 2.5, so we ended up with 2.79, right? As if there's some magic in 2.79 as an FAR. 3 stories, I get it. I have an idea of the form and the character of the neighborhood. In terms of the station area planning, you know, I just want to give you an example of this relationship of the planning and the zoning. At the Alameda Station in the Denver Design District, we had this very engaged process of doing the plan up front. Rather than negotiating a zoning like the site just south of it, which went through a 3-year, very controversial rezoning, this site, we did a plan first and focused on small street, small block scale, connecting the network of the development to the surrounding neighborhood rather than separating it, and talking about the transitions to the existing neighborhood in terms of scale of new development. We focused on the public spaces as the primary discussion and the scale, and used images like this to discuss the character and the form, and what the connections to the neighborhoods might look like and what they might provide. We looked at the hierarchy of public spaces from primary public spaces to the secondary system of spaces, and again, focusing on what amenity value do these public spaces provide to not only new communities, but the existing communities. And the interesting thing here is because we had significant neighborhood participation and support for the plan, because the code was very understandable to folks, the form-based planning approach and the form-based code actually increased the potential yield on the site. So in the plan, we got to a minimum of 5, a maximum of 14 stories for this area. When the site actually got rezoned, the neighborhood advocated for 16 stories. Okay, it's pretty rare in Denver when the neighborhood advocates for more development than they talked about when they did the plan. But I think it had a lot to do with, this is by the time that we had new zoning available, right? This new menu of new zone districts really helped change the picture to help Denver become a much more attractive place. And finally, I would say that when you're equipped with a better zoning code and better zoning tools, you're not done. It actually helps inform better planning, right? It's a continuous cycle. So those 2006 typologies in the strategic TOD plan were then used for the early planning, and they help shape the typologies that we defined in the context in the zoning code, and those 2 efforts combined now form the basis for the 2014 update of the strategic TOD plan in Denver, and they revised the names and the calibrations for the context based on how the new code works. right? So it's the new code, in fact, informing new planning and new opportunities. And in the 2014, they also updated and defined a set of new principles for TOD development. So overall, again, in terms of urban form, density and land use regulations, there are opportunities. It's not the, as Gil said, it's not the only thing, but there certainly are a number of great opportunities in updating codes and having better zoning tools so you can be proactive to get not only enhance the opportunity of TOD, but more importantly, to get the development that the community envisions. Thank you.